Yes, so good morning and welcome to our 20th meeting of Classical Mechanics 1. This is today is the 2nd of December, Thursday, 2nd of December 2021. Yeah, so just addressing some questions from Siddhant Shah on the phase for the phase angle for the harmonic oscillator. I will look once more into that. Meanwhile, any other questions?
Yes, sir. I had a question. I wanted to clarify if my understanding of time reversal invariance was accurate or correct.
Okay. Yes,
so
Gautam. Yes.
Particular, if we take the example of like a ball which is slowing down under friction, when we reverse time,
yes,
our initial conditions are going to be the final conditions of the normal, like quote unquote footage, right? Is that correct?
Yeah. It would be the final conditions of the original motion. Yes, you have a certain motion, and then when you reverse time, where the velocity of the final state will be reversed when you consider it as the initial condition for the new motion.
Okay, right. That was what I wanted to clarify, sir. Yeah.
Fine. Yes. Yes.
Got it. Thank you.
The final condition of the original motion becomes the initial condition of the new one.
Got it, sir.
Yeah.
Sir, but can be described by a potential, sir? Can friction be described by potential?
No, friction cannot be described by potential. Friction is the frictional force depends on velocity, so it is not the derivative of some v of x, because then you will not get an x dot from there. But that doesn't prevent you from discussing time reversal.
Okay, sir.
Yeah. So that was Milan Paul. Yeah. Okay. Any other questions?
Sir, could you give the answer for the cells? Last question in the assignment 7? Only the last part, the C part.
Okay, sure. Yes, let me discuss that quickly. Let me share my screen. Moment. Okay.
Sir, when we reverse in the time reversal case, the direction of force will not change, right?
Oh, well, no, depends what the force is. I mean, if the force depends on this position, then alone, then yeah, it will not change. But if the force depends on velocity, then it can change. That was Milan. And in fact, that is the whole point of this fourth problem in the problem set 7. Yeah. So is that the thing you are asking, Milan?
Sir, I was just thinking about that friction case that he asked.
Yes. So yes, it is not as though the force will has a definite sign or something. It can reverse or not reverse depending on the type of force.
Okay, sir.
Yeah. So I just yeah. So I'm just going to briefly discuss this Lorentz force equation of motion, which is question 4 of problem set 7, which you have all submitted yesterday and before that. Wait a minute, I have a question from Pinjay. Yeah, so the question is very relevant, but he asked, Ripunjay Dwivedi asked, sir, in the fourth question of the problem set 7, we can see that a magnetic field comes from a current which also reverses direction upon time reversal. And so the law actually obeys time reversal symmetry. Yeah, that is correct. But the question is carefully stated. We are saying this is a fixed magnetic field. So we in the problem at hand, we are regarding the magnetic field as externally specified. We are not reversing the current in the wire which created the magnetic field in the first place. That is a different problem, very relevant. So if you include the motion of the charges in that wire and apply time reversal there, then the system as a whole is time reversal invariant. But when we look at the magnetic field as a specified external field, it is not time reversal invariant. Does that address your question, Ripunjay? Though I'm going to elaborate a little bit. Okay, I don't know where Ripunjay is. Fine. So the Newton Lorentz equation of motion describes a charge. Okay, I forgot whether I called this charge Q. Is it charge Q mass m particle? So the equation of motion says mr double dot is equal to Q times r dot cross B of r. Yeah, I'm including the electric field now because this was concerning the magnetic field. Now this thing is the velocity of the particle, and B is a fixed magnetic field. So we are not describing how this magnetic field was produced. Indeed, one could consider that question as well. And Ripunjay says, yes, sir, it does. Thank you. Okay, so here we are in this equation of motion. When we take t to minus t, without writing all the details, the equation basically becomes the r double dot goes to r double dot of minus t. The two time derivatives, no change in sign. Whereas the one time derivative does incur a change in sign. So the equation then becomes m double dot minus t is equal to q times minus r dot of minus t cross b of r of minus t. All right. So the message is, the main message is that the sign of the right hand side changes under time reversal. Okay, I hope this basic issue is clear to everybody. If you have one derivative, it will change sign. If you have two derivatives, it won't change sign. If you have the square of the first derivative, again, it will not change sign. That is the main message. And now the question was, among other things, so r of minus t does not satisfy the same equation as r of t. So system is not time reversal invariant. Okay, so that is the answer to the question. Now, the part C asked to interpret the equation satisfied by r of minus t. Okay, so that was the question. So the part C, the answer, perhaps some of you have got it. Okay, would anybody like to suggest an answer before I?
Yes, sir.
Yes, Shubham Kumar.
Oh, you want to, okay.
Okay, like I'm not sure, but this is the equation which is satisfied by a particle of charge minus q.
Correct. Yeah, correct. Yeah, so absolutely correct. So the part C has a very simple interpretation. This new equation, so r of minus t is the trajectory of a particle of same mass m, but with opposite charge. Yeah, because q has gone to minus q. I mean, if you compare the original equation and this, the equation satisfied by r and the equation satisfied by r of minus t, the only change is that q has been replaced by minus q. Okay, so the time reversed equation describes a particle of opposite charge. which is not the same as the original one. Yeah. Of opposite charge moving in the same magnetic field. Yeah, mass has not changed. Okay. Yeah, so Ripunjay asks, can we also say that it is the mirror image of R of t about an appropriate axis of symmetry? Well, appropriately interpreted, yeah, some, yeah, perhaps one can. I mean, I hesitate to, one has to say what exactly is meant by this mirror image and so on. But if you can clarify that, maybe one can understand it that way. But I hesitate to do that right now over here.
Sir?
Yes, please, Srimati Srikanth. Yes.
So I have. So does the oppositely charged particle also have to have the same initial conditions, or like in the sense the trajectory that we describe here?
Yeah. So. Okay. So okay, it's something like this. Okay, let me explain it in a physical manner. Suppose you have a magnetic field. Let us suppose the magnetic field is pointing along this pen. Yeah. I mean, in this direction. Yeah. Now, a particle of a particular charge, let us say positive charge, would be seen to follow a certain trajectory. Now, that trajectory, I will give an example. It may be like a helical coil, yeah, or a circular trajectory like cyclotron motion, but in general it can be helical and going round and round this axis. This is one possible motion which you may have heard of. But there is something very special there. Once you specify the charge, the particle will go clockwise or counterclockwise. It cannot be both. Given the charge, there is only one way it can go because of the direction of the force. Let us suppose Q is positive. Now, okay, depending on the initial velocity, V cross B, B is pointing in this direction. So V cross B will point in a particular direction, and that will, wait a minute, yeah. Now the oppositely charged particle will do exactly the opposite. For the same initial velocity, if you take an oppositely charged particle, if the other one went clockwise, this one will go counterclockwise. So that is the difference.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, maybe I will try to mention that more carefully once again. But for now, let me keep it like that. Any other question about this problem?
So just another question about this problem.
Yes,
Can you also interpret it as the same particle moving subject to a force that's corresponding to negative BR? Like
yeah, you could say that. Sure. You can say that. Yeah, you could say that the magnetic, instead of saying the charge has changed sign, you could say the magnetic field direction has changed sign. Yeah, that is okay. Yeah, the equation has that same interpretation.
Can we say like the force is the opposite thing? The force acting on the particle is the opposite.
Okay, sure. Yeah. Yes. You could say that as well, I guess. Yeah. So there are. Yeah. The direction of the force. I think that is what you mean. Yes. Yeah. The direction of the force, comparing with this equation and this equation. The direction of the force is opposite, or you could say the charge is opposite, or you could say the magnetic field has reversed direction. All our options are good.
So,
Okay. Yes.
this type of questions, like interpret in qualitative physical quantities, basically we are trying to give attribute the one change in the equation to any physical property, right? Is that-
Well, I mean, you are trying to, no, you have got an original equation. It describes certain things. Yeah, the original equation describes the motion of a particle of charge Q, mass M, in a certain fixed magnetic field. Now you got one new equation for a new variable called R of minus T, which you could simply call S of T, R of minus T. So S of T will satisfy some equation. We want to know what does that describe physically. If S is the position vector of some particle, what does that describe physically? So it is up to your creativity, imagination to propose some thing. Is that what you are asking?
Like my question was how to basically what these kind of questions mean, because if you remember last time also I was having problems interpreting what the question was asking for. Like that's the doubt I was having. I'm still having.
Okay. No, sorry, sir. Please repeat your question. I misunderstood. I didn't understand properly.
My doubt is this kind of question interpret in qualitative physical quantities.
Qualitative physical terms.
Terms. I'm sorry. What is this kind of question asking for? Like, is it asking for like the change in the equation? We have an old equation and now we have the new equation, right?
Yes.
So the change in the new equation compared to the old equation, is the question asking key like basically attribute this one change to some quantity that we've mentioned over here?
Partly. No, I mean, no, you can forget about the first equation. This is now a problem concerning the second equation, and we want to know what it describes physically. And okay, to give you a suggestion, if the answer is of the sort we have given here, we are given 3 answers here. That is the nature of the answer one is expected to give. That it describes a particle of charge Q, mass M, moving in a magnetic field which has reversed its direction. That's one answer, acceptable. Yeah, or the first answer was even nice also. It's mass M, charge minus Q, moving in the original magnetic field. That is also okay. So that is the kind of thing we are looking for.
Sir, is this an acceptable answer that
yes, Shashwat Asthana, yes.
Yes, that in the initial conditions the velocity will be reversed, so force will be reversed, something like this, because that as an interpretation. I didn't give anything directly. I just said that velocity will be reversed in the initial conditions, so force will be reversed and it will go in the opposite direction.
Okay, yeah, it's kind of all right. I would like it a bit more. See, I think having had this discussion, perhaps, see, a qualitative physical interpretation, at least to my taste, the nicest answer I have heard so far is it describes a particle of opposite charge. That's it, in the same magnetic field. I think everybody can relate to that. And that's the optimal answer, I feel. Yes, yeah, but what you have said is also okay. I mean, what you have said is also okay, that okay, the force has reversed the direction, fine. But you might ask yourself, how can you incorporate that the reversed force direction? Can you incorporate it in some physical quantity or something? So some people said you have changed the direction of the magnetic field. Some people said you have changed the sign of the charge. So that is helpful, I feel.
Okay, sir, got it.
Yeah, all right.
It's slightly out of the way, but
yes, or Romit, yes, please.
So the way I interpreted it was like keeping the particles same. The convention for magnetic field as described by movement, or the convention for electric charge as, I mean, considering the whole charge is like, for example, considering electrons as positive, like changing the convention, keeping the particles. Does that make sense? I mean,
well,
because that it's the same particle. And
well, I hesitate a bit. See, convention cannot produce a change in the physics, a change in convention. So I hesitate to take that as the interpretation. Here, really, there is a change in the sort of trajectory, I mean, the sort of motion. So one needs to convey that impression, that feature. If you change your convention, then the original equation itself will have to be reinterpreted. I mean, I see where you're coming from. But I think what you're saying finally amounts to talking about, in more simple terms, a particle of opposite charge.
Yes, it does.
So we might as well do that and keep the convention unchanged. Yeah. Okay. So then there are additional questions concerning from Abdul Alim. Is it related to Feynman's idea that a positron is an electron moving backwards in time? Was it Wheeler who suggested this? Yeah, so Wheeler and Feynman were indeed involved in understanding these things. Yeah, now, okay, this is related to that. Yes, there is a relation to those issues. A more precise discussion probably doesn't quite belong here, but I do agree. This the two are related in some ways. Yeah, but they're not exactly the same. They're not exactly the same matter. But yeah, they are related, definitely. Okay, so but that is a good point from Abdul. Yeah. But see, look, here I say related. Here we are looking at forward time evolution in both the equations. We are simply playing the original equation in reverse, but considering it as forward evolution. So we are not talking about anybody moving backwards in time. So I just want to keep that in mind. Yeah. Okay. All right. So any other questions right now about this? This is an interesting matter. So it is good we have at least begun such a discussion. Okay, if not, let me then, yeah. So let me then, so this is related, I mean, yeah, this is Feynman's PhD thesis and related work on space-time interpretation of electromagnetism. Yeah, so let me now return to our discussion of gravity, Newton's inverse square of law of the force between two massive bodies. Let us recall that last time we had reached the stage using Kepler's first and second laws. Using Kepler's first and second laws, we had come to the conclusion that the gravitational force is plausibly central. That is, the force depends only on the radial distance from the origin and points radially, either inward or outward, depending on the sign of this function f. This involved two steps. One, observing that the motion is on a plane, which was Kepler's first law in part, and the second, that the aerial velocity was a constant, which we used to deduce that the angular momentum was conserved, both in direction and in magnitude, which was a feature of central forces, which is why we made this guess. Okay, now what we now wish to do is to use Kepler's third law to fix this unknown function f of r to the extent possible. Okay, so this is the aim right now. So now the inverse square nature of the force can be guessed from Newton's third law, sorry, from Kepler's third law, which told us that t squared is proportional to r cubed, the proportionality constant being 1 upon k, which was Kepler's constant. Yeah, Yeah. And same for all planets. Yeah. So now to see this, let us first note that the eccentricity of several planetary orbits is fairly small. In particular, that was the Earth is 0.02. So that is very small. So they approximately describe uniform circular motion. Yeah. And so let us apply Kepler's third law to that special case. Yeah. So Kepler's law, third law, certainly applies to these planets which have nearly circular orbits. So let us see what it implies for them. Yeah, I mean, when I say uniform circular motion, that is coming from Kepler's second law, because it covers equal areal velocity in equal intervals of time. And therefore, the motion had to be uniform if it is circular. Okay. So now consider a planet such as the Earth moving uniformly around a circle. This is something we have studied before. A circle of radius r at constant angular speed omega. Now it takes a time t equal to 2 pi upon omega to go around one circular orbit. And therefore, because the motion is uniform, its linear speed is given by the distance covered, which is the circumference 2 pi r upon t, which is itself 2 pi upon omega. So taking the quotient, the 2 pi's cancel, and you get that the speed is equal to r omega. Familiar to us, of course, where omega is the angular speed. Now, to find its acceleration, we do the usual thing. We write the position vector in the xy plane as r vector as r cosine omega t, comma r sine omega t. Differentiate in time, you get the velocity vector r dot omega r times minus sine omega t, comma cosine omega t, simply differentiating in time. And then you do it once again, you get the acceleration vector. This is something we have done before, so I will not repeat that. Yeah, I'm sorry to interrupt here my discussion. It is known that there are several students in this batch who do not submit any homework, assignment, midterm, and other such things. Those who are doing that are aware of who they are. That is, of course, not okay. And you have been approached, you have been contacted by email, both by me as well as by dean as well as faculty advisors. We have not received replies or anything. Anyway, it is not possible for you to pass the course in this manner. I hope you are aware of this. Yeah, the course is defined by our discussions. The assignments they play a very important role. So if you don't do those or do them well, I'm sorry, you cannot expect to pass this course. Okay, so in particular, you cannot hope to somehow in the last week of the course make up a passing grade in the course. It doesn't work that way. If you have not woken up till now, I am afraid Sushupta Sthiti will continue. Okay, so yeah, so now coming back to our discussion of the motion of the Earth in its circular orbit, we have already observed that this acceleration vector is minus omega squared times the radius vector. So that is centripetal, it is directed radially inwards, and that is given by minus v squared upon r hat. Okay, so let us make use of this. Any question about this? Okay, good. So Newton's second law requires that this radially inward centripetal acceleration be equal to the inward gravitational force per unit mass, okay, of the Earth. So that is Newton's second law. So let us write it out explicitly. We have already argued that the force, Newtonian gravitational force, must be of the form minus f of r hat. Yeah, I mean, we are thinking of f as some positive function here because it's radially inward, and it must equal mass times acceleration. So me times acceleration, which we have just computed, is minus v squared by r hat. So we are equating these two and make use of the formula for v as 2 pi r upon t the whole squared. Yeah, so v squared is 2 pi r upon t the whole squared. So here cancelling the r hats, or at least comparing the coefficients, we then conclude that v squared is equal to okay, on the one hand, v squared is equal to 2 pi r squared by t squared. On the other hand, v squared is equal to sorry, here I am making use of Kepler's third law, which replaces t squared by r cubed upon k. So that's what we put here, and retain the 2 pi r whole squared there. Yeah, so this is our v squared, and I just substitute it in the original equation and solve for f of r. So f of r is going to be equal to v squared upon r times the mass. So there we are. Substituting the v squared, I get 4 pi squared k me upon r squared. So that is the main conclusion. This is very nice because it is telling us, sorry, oh, I hope I didn't lose it. Yeah. So this is telling us that the force is an inverse square force. It's also proportional to Kepler's constant and to the mass of the Earth. Okay. So any question about how we got this?
Sir,
yeah.
Sir, what is f of r the force? F of r is force per unit mass, or like it is the total force?
Let us see where we defined it. F of r is the force itself. Yeah, because the F force was written as f of r times r hat. R hat is dimensionless. So up to the minus sign, it is the force itself, not per unit mass. Is there a, okay, let me come back here.
Sir, shouldn't the mass of the object also be here? I'm not sure.
Sorry, who is Siddhant is asking? What is the question
yes,
again? Yeah.
Sir, the mass of the object, because Kepler's gravitational, it's g m1 m2 by r squared. Right?
No. We don't know anything about g m1 m2 by r squared. We are deriving that, or we are deducing that.
Yeah, no. My point is there should be one more mass over here. If I
okay. Yeah, we are coming to that. Very good point. Very good point. That is the very next sentence. Good. Yeah. So yes, you are ahead of us. Now, besides the inverse square nature, the above gravitational force on the Earth due to the Sun, as we see from Formula 100, is proportional to the Earth's mass me. Okay, so that you have observed, and you are very concerned where is the Sun's mass. Yeah, and the answer is that now k is independent of the planet. Okay, so I mean, k doesn't depend on me. That's the first statement. K is independent of the planet. That is one of the important conclusions that Kepler arrived at from Tycho Brahe's observations. So we are saying that the force is proportional to the Earth's mass. Yeah, and therefore the Earth's acceleration, which is given by this v squared by r, the me will cancel. It is independent of the Earth's mass. Okay, the Earth's acceleration is independent of the Earth's mass. Okay, couple of comments. Now comes the important thing from Newton. Newton postulates that that is that the force of the Sun on the Earth being proportional to the mass of the Earth must also be true of the force felt by the Sun due to the Earth. Yeah, so this is essentially a version of his third law. Yeah, and concluded that this Kepler constant k must be proportional to the Sun's mass. Okay. At that stage, it is simply some constant. He concludes using this reciprocity requirement that k must be proportional to the Sun's mass. Thus, we arrive at the law of gravitation of Newton, So we replace K by GMS. Yeah. So if I do that, we arrive at this law. Now, okay, there is some 4 pi squared also sitting around. Perhaps I want to get rid of that. So I will write 4 pi squared K is GMS. So if we do that, we will come to the conclusion that the gravitational force of the sun on the earth can be expressed as minus G ms me by r squared, r hat. So it is attractive. It points radially inwards, and G is some new constant. It is now a replacement for the Kepler's constant, having removed the sun's mass. So does that answer your question, Siddhant?
Yes, sir. I got scared because I didn't realize that the mass of the sun was absorbed in K.
Yeah. Yes, it was hiding inside K, or K has, or it has emerged from K. I would better put it that way. It has emerged from K.
Sir,
Yes, please.
I didn't understand that. Could you repeat how we concluded K is proportional to mass of sun?
Good question. So see, Newton is taking one more step. We are solving an inverse problem. There is no one solution to this problem. And you need inspiration, you need guesswork, you need luck. You may need to hope and then check and such things. All right. So we're going to do precisely that. So far, we only reached up to this stage that F of R, the force, is proportional to the mass of the earth because K is independent of the mass of the earth. Are you comfortable with that much?
This is from Kepler.
Yeah, absolutely from Kepler. From Kepler's laws, all 3 laws, telling us that K is independent of the mass of the earth because it's the same for Mars and Venus as well as the earth. So it must be independent of the mass of the earth. And therefore, the force of the sun on the earth is proportional to the mass of the earth. Now, Newton comes along and says that let us consider the force of the earth on the sun, and he wants that to have the same feature. Okay, this is a part of his 3rd law, that the force of the sun on the earth is proportional to the mass of the earth, and therefore he wants the force of the earth on the sun to be proportional to the mass of the sun. Okay, this reciprocal arrangement. And therefore, the only way this can happen is if K itself depends on the mass of the sun in a proportionate manner. Yeah, and therefore Newton postulates that 4 pi k squared, so 4 pi k must be proportional to the mass of the sun through some proportionality constant G, which is Newton's gravitational constants. Yeah, so is that better now?
So he wanted it to satisfy 3rd law. So
Correct.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, suggested this. Okay, yes.
Correct. I mean, it all went together. If you wish, the 3rd law was being created at the same time when this subject was being studied. So all these ideas came together at roughly the same time. Of course, both terrestrial and celestial phenomena were being considered. So Newton was considering terrestrial phenomena also, where the 3rd law made a lot of sense. And so he wants that to be valid also for Sun-Earth system.
Yeah, thank you.
Yes, sure. Yes, sorry, who is that?
Shubham Kumar.
Yes, please go ahead.
Sir, can you scroll it a bit? I had a doubt in the previous point.
Yes, please.
Sir, in the equation where you have written that F of R, you have derived some expression for that.
Correct. Yes.
Sir, in the mass of that ME, it is the inertial mass of the body, right? So was our discussion of gravitational mass and inertial mass then pointless, because from here this equation actually is before the times of Newton. So the inertial mass pops out directly from Kepler's laws in the gravitational equation, the law of gravitation. So
okay, your query is a very good one. You are right that ME. So yeah, one could try to be somewhat more careful here. Yeah, at this in this discussion, we have been a bit cavalier. This ME, as you point out, what really is it? It came from mass times acceleration. So it's really the inertial mass of the sun. Sorry, inertial mass of the Earth. Yes. So let me. So you were saying that our discussion of gravitational and inertial mass was somewhat pointless because here we. Okay. Let me say it this way. This discussion is consistent with that. Yeah. So your point is very well taken and is recognized. That the suggestion here from Newton is finally that this G, if you use this reciprocity requirement, it should be proportional to the inertial mass of the sun, right? That is your point.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, that is your point, and therefore there is no room for any so-called gravitational mass. That is what you are saying.
Yes, sir.
Yes, on the face of it, that is. I think you are correct. This is. Yeah, but I think yeah. So correct. So yeah, I take your point that in our discussion here there is no room for a gravitational mass, and a more careful study of this is required to make better sense of it. At this stage, I want to leave it at that, pending a more careful discussion. Yeah, let me. Okay, so this requires a more careful discussion, but your point is very much accepted. Okay, so okay. Okay, any other question? All right. Okay, so in that case, let us move to the next step, which is just to observe that there is a potential from which this can be derived. Okay, just a matter of notation here. I will, yeah, there is of course G has a certain value, numerical value. It's 6.67 times 10 to the minus 11 Newton meter squared per kilogram squared. Now we will we will often use an abbreviation alpha for GMEMS. Yeah, so your point, Shubham, is well taken. My discussion has not been very careful to make the distinction, and a more careful treatment is required to really bring out where there is a room for a gravitational mass or the possibility for that. So I don't want to attempt to do that here now. Okay, so using this abbreviation alpha for GMEMS, okay, so you can of course compute what G is, alpha is, using the masses of the sun and the earth, so on. Now, as I said last time, having now inferred a certain force law, Newton's universal gravitational force law, it is possible to now address the direct problem, namely, given this force law and some initial conditions, find trajectories of planets. And it is possible to do that by solving Newton's second law equation of motion. We will not do that here for lack of time, but it turns out that Kepler's first law on elliptical orbits, yeah, may now be derived by solving Newton's equation of motion using this law of gravitation. Okay, so that is the direct problem, and a very interesting one. That is a problem in differential equations and geometry and so on. Okay, I'm not going to do that here right now.
Excuse me, sir.
Yes, please.
I just wanted to point out that the first, Kepler's first law derived from the Newton's law. This can also be done without differential equations and all that. Like 3 Blue 1 Brown has a video on it, which
Sorry,
it does by Pure.
Who has?
A channel named 3 Blue 1 Brown has a video on it in which he discusses the how Feynman's approach by pure geometry.
Okay. Yeah. Sure. No. Yeah, you are right. Yeah, you don't need to do it to differential equation. In fact, Newton himself did it without differential equation. The entire Newton's book doesn't have any differential equation. He has done everything to geometry. So
yes, sir, but that was very pretty, like with pure geometry only, using without differential equations.
Sure. Yeah, you're right. You're right. Yeah. So yeah, we are not obliged to use differential equations. There are other techniques through geometric techniques to deduce that the orbits are these conic sections and so on. Okay. So thank you for pointing that out. Yeah, I mean, Newton himself did not use differential equations in his book very much. I mean, hardly at all. In fact, because differential equations were not yet in use, and even the notation was not there. So though he did understand many things, so that it is also understandable by others, he presented everything in a very geometric fashion. Some of those things now are easier to understand or generalize using differential equations, can go a lot further. But Newton himself did not do that as much.
Sir, do you recommend actually reading the Principia like now in this day and age? Would it be any relevant to this?
You can see, reading the whole thing will take time, but one can at least glance at how he organizes it, the corollaries and the principles. I mean, the postulates or the laws, and I think the Subramanian Chandrasekhar spent several years of his life towards the end reading and preparing a translation. Preparing a book on Newton's Principia. So you don't have to read the original. There are presentations by others, in particular by Chandrasekhar. So there are things that one can, but look, I'm not saying that it is necessary to go and read the original now to understand these types of this kind of physics. From time to time, you may want to glance at it, and it will, yes, no doubt, it is a rewarding exercise. And as I said, the approach he takes is very different from the approach we are using now in this presentation. He's a master at geometry, and he doesn't use differential equations. So the approach is quite different. And there are a host of theorems that he proves over there. Very surprising and elegant results. So yeah, there are nuggets of wonderful things in that book. There are translations, of course, and which you can consult. That was Anand, was it? Yeah.
Oh yes, it was.
That's right. Yeah. So Newton's book is Chandrasekhar's book is called Newton's Principia for Common Reader or some such thing. I forget the precise name. But Chandrasekhar thought it is worthwhile. So okay for Chandrasekhar, so okay for us, I suppose.
Okay, thanks.
Somebody says, Vijayan Rai says, Newton's Principia for Common Readers. Okay, so I presume that is the title of Chandrasekhar's book. So coming back to our Newtonian gravitational force, we observe using result from question 1 of problem set 3, which is why that question was given in the first place, we may now notice that the Newtonian gravitational force is derivable from the gravitational potential V of r equal to minus alpha upon r. Okay, so suppose you take a potential V of r equal to minus alpha upon r, compute its gradient, or more precisely the negative gradient, then you have already shown in question 1 of problem set 3 that upon computing minus gradient with respect to r of V of r, you get minus alpha upon r squared r hat. Okay, so Newton's gravitational force follows from a potential, and all the consequences that come from that, in particular that you can write a conserved energy, follow from that.
So can't
Yes.
we say something more like in a central force fields are conserved?
Yeah, I mean, f of r being this particular function 1 by r squared is not necessary. Yeah, you can, yes, you can generally other f of r's would also lead to arise from potentials. Yeah, you just need to compute appropriate antiderivatives to get it. That's true. Okay, so yeah, let us, okay, now I don't need to remind you what the gradient is, but it is in Cartesian coordinates, it is d by dx, d by d by d by dz, the vector operator of that sort. Yeah, differential operator. But you have already done this in the homework. Any question about this aspect? Yeah, okay, so so the gravitational force is called central since it points radially and is spherically symmetric. Yeah, so it depends only on r, radially, and depends only on the magnitude of r. Yeah, yeah, the magnitude depends only on magnitude of r. The corresponding potential V of r depends only on the distance from the origin and is called a central or spherically symmetric potential. Okay, so that is the name used for it. So just to summarize, in obtaining the 1 by r potential, so this is called the 1 by r potential. V of r equal to minus alpha by r. It's called the 1 by r potential. From Kepler's laws, we have in effect solved an inverse problem. That is the point of view I've taken all along. And that is to deduce a potential from features of trajectories. So more specifically here, we have deduced a potential or a force from the period of oscillations that it supports. Yeah, Kepler's third law tells you something about the time period. T squared proportional to r cubed, T squared equal to 1 by k r cubed. That is a property of certain periodic motions. And using that, we have deduced the potential. Okay, so that is the inverse problem that has been a solution to that inverse problem has been proposed over here. Needless to say, to solve such a problem in general is very difficult. And Isaac Newton and his contemporaries like Edmund Halley and Robert Hooke were very lucky to have succeeded in this case of central importance, no pun intended. Yeah, but these inverse problems are very important in all areas of science, and yeah, they come up in medicine, in oil exploration, everywhere. I mean, tomography, if you, yeah, X-rays are used to scan a person's body, but from that you want to deduce a distribution of objects inside the body. So you are looking at you send X-rays into the body, they get scattered, come out, you detect them. So you are seeing the trajectories of certain photons, some particles coming in and out. Based on those trajectories, you want to deduce what is inside the body. In particular, you want to know what is the density of the material inside the body. Where is it more dense? Where is it less dense? Where are the bones? Where is the water? And so on. So that is again an inverse problem, very difficult inverse problem. It is now routinely done using numerical techniques. But that is another example of an inverse problem. Same way, oil exploration, you send sound waves or other waves into the earth, and you detect those sound waves. And then from that, you want to infer what is the distribution of mass inside the earth. where are there cavities, where is it likely to be some oil, where is it likely to be some other mineral perhaps. So these are all inverse problems. Yeah, a large part of our modern activities have to do with inverse problems. Okay, and they are very, very difficult to solve. Now, okay, so now having got this Newton's inverse square law of gravitation, the question is it correct? Yeah. Now, the lunar perihelion problem was a story of that. So I just want to make a few remarks about this. So it took time for Newton's inverse square law of gravitational force to be tested and widely accepted. Yeah. In fact, Newton, who lived a fairly long life, 1643 to 1727, showed that it did give the observed elliptical orbits of some planets and comets. Yeah, so that was by solving the direct problem through geometric methods, as was pointed out. However, a difficulty arose in applying Newton's inverse square law of gravitation to lunar motion. Now, the moon's orbit around the Earth was observed to precess. So the moon's, so this is the Earth. Yeah, the moon's orbit, it is, let us draw it here. Unfortunately, it is not a closed orbit. The next stage, it changes a little bit. Next revolution, it changes. I'm exaggerating a bit. Actually, I'm not exaggerating too much. Yeah, so it keeps precessing. In fact, the precession of the lunar orbit around the Earth is quite big. The lunar perigee means point of closest approach. So in this case, it is somewhere here. Yeah, my picture is not so good. Anyway, the perigee, if I say the perigee is here, the perigee itself has moved from here to there to there. Yeah, roughly. Okay, my picture is not so good. But the point is that the perigee, that is the point of closest approach to the Earth, rotates by 40 degrees of arc per annum. So in one year, in 1 year, the moon is going to go around the Earth many, many times. Yeah, there are 12 months. So it moves by 40 degrees. So this is visible to the naked eye, of course, it's enormous precession. Now, of course, Newton's law applied to the Earth-Moon system does not say that the orbit is going to precess. It just says there's an elliptical orbit which will go on forever, periodically. Now, this precession was believed to be due to the sun's effect on the Earth-Moon system. Okay, because the sun is very heavy and not so far away, and so the sun's effect was believed to be responsible for this precession of the lunar perigee. This leads to the famous three-body problem of celestial mechanics. Yeah, the sun, moon, earth problem. Yeah, Newton tried to estimate the motion of the lunar perigee due to the sun's effect by developing a kind of something called perturbation theory, but he could account for only about half of it, and he was not able to understand it. So there were lingering doubts about whether the 1/r² force law was actually correct, or whether it is only approximately correct. In fact, Alexis Clairaut, the French mathematical physicist, even proposed a small 1/r³ correction to the 1/r² force law. Yeah. So as I think Bijayan said, you can have also other functions, not just 1/r². Or somebody had brought this up before. I forget. It was many some weeks ago. So he proposed a 1/r³ correction, which would lead to such precession motion. Yeah, and in a 1/r³, 1/r² force law is very special. It leads to closed orbits. It is no longer true for other power laws like 1/r³. And he suggested that that is the reason for the precession. A lively debate, a competition ensued among Euler, Clairaut, and D'Alembert. So Euler is, of course, Swiss, German, and working in St. Petersburg in Russia. Clairaut and D'Alembert both are French. They worked to develop a theory of solar perturbations to the moon's orbit over many years. And there was even a prize of the Paris Academy, I believe, for this. to produce accurate lunar tables because observing the moon's position in the sky was a way of locating a ship, tell at what longitude the ship is. People who used lunar tables to find that out. This is before global positioning system and such things. And so it was of great practical importance in that era of exploration of the continents to have accurate lunar tables. And all these people were involved in that. And eventually Clairaut himself was able to use the purely inverse square force law to account for 85% of the motion of the lunar perigee, using what is called a third order perturbative treatment of the sun's effect. I mean, this is a sort of successive approximations. Newton had gone only to second order or something like that. And Clairaut went one step further and found that actually the 1/r² force law is adequate to explain the motion of the lunar perigee. So this was a great success for Newton's inverse square force law. So this and subsequent work on other solar system trajectories eventually led to the widespread acceptance of Newton's laws of motion as well as gravity. Okay, so this is a tremendous triumph of science, and these are all very, very hard calculations, all done by hand. It will surprise you just the staggering effort that people have put into this.
Sir?
Yes.
Sorry, what does precession like exactly mean?
Precession means the following. So if you have the Earth-Moon system, according to Newton's laws and Kepler's laws, the orbit of the moon is an ellipse, full stop. Okay. In particular, perigee, so this is the Earth and that's the moon. Perigee, point of closest approach, is fixed. It doesn't move. Okay. It doesn't precess. It doesn't move. Now, what is observed is not this. This is only approximately true. If you wait a few months, the moon's orbit, unfortunately, is not the same ellipse.
So like plane shape?
No, the plane doesn't change much. Plane is practically the same. But see, okay, let us see. A precessing ellipse is a very poor way of talking about a trajectory that is not even a closed curve. It looks like a precessing ellipse. I tried to draw it before. All I'm saying is that after a few months, the moon is following a slightly different orbit, namely something that looks like this, okay, where its perigee is now moved a little bit.
Yes.
Has moved a little bit. So we call this the precession of the perigee. Precession simply means movement. Yeah, some kind of I'll give additional examples. So this motion of the perigee or the rotation of the ellipse itself is called precession. Is it clear what precession means?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, great.
The plane thing. That's all. Like
the plane doesn't change. No, the plane is practically unchanged. Yeah. There are other examples of precession. Yeah, the motion of a pambaram or top lattu is also displays precession. Yeah, which you may have observed. So a toy top that you may play with on and spin on the floor displays several motions. One is the spinning motion about its axis. Yeah, but if that axis is inclined relative to the gravitational field, the vertical, then it is seen, I hope you have seen, that the axis of spinning of the top itself changes. Yeah, as the top spins, the axis of spinning motion itself changes. In fact, it rotates, sweeping out a cone, and that is called the precession of the top in a gravitational field. Okay, so that is another example. Okay. Any other question about this?
Sir, I had a question about the
okay,
second
so that was
to last point.
Srimati. Now we have come to Gautam Vishwanathan. Yes, please.
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
So third order in this case implies using third degree terms to correct.
No, not third degree. No, it is, see, one has to concoct a small quantity here. A small quantity like the mass of the moon divided by the mass of the sun. Yeah, so that's a small quantity. There are other such small quantities like the mass of the earth divided by the mass of the sun. Yeah, so one tries to express the solution to this problem as a power series in such small quantities. All right, and with the hope that such a series, which when truncated after maybe 2-3 terms, already gives a good approximation. So that is the idea. So when one says a first order treatment, first order perturbative treatment, so suppose you are computing some physical quantity, okay, let us call that physical quantity F, yeah, and F depends on the mass of the earth divided by the mass of the sun. Yeah, suppose it is a function of that quantity. Maybe you expand that as some F0 times, just F0 plus some F1 ME upon MS plus F2 times ME upon MS squared plus dot dot dot. Okay, and the whole labor is to find these coefficients F0, F1, and F2. What we are saying is that Newton found only F0 or F0 and F1. That would be called a first order. This is called zeroth order perturbative treatment. This is first order perturbative treatment. Yeah, the zeroth order will be exact if you assume that the sun is infinitely massive. Yeah? Or if you assume that the mass of the earth is 0 compared to the sun. Yeah? But since that is not the case, you have to include these corrections. So this would be called a first order. This would be called second order. Yeah, and Clairo went to third order, right? Okay. Yeah, so he took one more term. So that's the kind of thing. Is that clear?
Yes, sir, but I also had one more question. In context of this, what do we mean when we say that Clairo used the purely inverse square force law to do this? Because it seems like he's adding more terms. So
no. See, Clairo, okay, maybe I went a little bit fast.
So do those like extra terms come when you like add like some kind of epsilon to R and do a kind of Taylor expansion or something?
Sorry. When you say extra terms, are you talking about this 1 by R cubed, or are you talking about these things?
I'm talking about the F1 and F2.
No, they are not extra terms. They are, see, let us see. Okay, I said many things. Let me go back a step. First, Clairo proposed that if you have a 1 by R cubed plus 1 by R squared, yeah, both are present, then he can explain the precession of the moon. Okay, the moon's perigee. Yeah, and that is true. It is possible to do that. The question is it correct or wrong? Turns out that is wrong. The correct explanation is that it is due to purely 1 by R squared force. Yeah, but computed very carefully. So, and now let us look at a solar system observable, like the location of the perigee of the moon. Okay, that is some quantity. It is located somewhere. It is a function of the Earth's mass as well as the sun's mass. I hope you will agree. I mean, all solar system quantities depend on these things. So it must depend on them.
Right.
Yeah. Now, upon doing some dimensional analysis and so on, suppose you are able to extract out the main dimensions and write some dimensionless function of only ratios. Okay. Now you want to compute that quantity. And I mean, I'm suppressing a lot of things here. All I'm saying is that if you wanted to compute a quantity that depends on this small mass ratio, it is reasonable to try to expand that in a power series. See, it is some quantity. It is some unknown function. We cannot determine it easily. So we determine it in a power series by computing its coefficients. That is all.
Okay. I think I'm seeing it a bit more now.
A little bit more now. Okay.
Yeah. A little bit more,
I think I have jumped a little bit over here, which is understandable that why you are a bit confused or I have not spoken very clearly. Let me. So do you want me to elaborate more on this, or are you okay with it?
I think I'm okay with it, sir. I think
okay.
I'm okay with it for now, and I'll have to think about this. I'll look it up.
Okay, or okay. Let me just devote 1 more minute to this. Yeah, 1 minute doesn't become 1 minute. See, suppose you are interested in the position of the moon, that is R. It is a function of time. This is some unknown position of the moon. You want to predict it. However, it also depends parametrically on the mass of the moon divided by the mass of the sun. Okay. This is the function you wish to determine. Now, what we do in our Kepler problem and so on is to assume that it is independent of this ratio. That is, we put this ratio to 0, assuming ms is infinite, yeah, and mass of the sun, yeah. So, but that is not quite true, because it really does depend on that ratio. I mean, it depends on both mm and ms, yeah. So the idea is you will write this r as some r0 of t, which is coming from assuming the sun is not even there or is infinitely far away or something like that. And then a correction term, which is r1 of t times m over ms plus r2 of t times over ms squared plus ... in the hope that computing these coefficients can be done somehow. Okay. This is called a perturbative approximation to finding the trajectory of the moon, assuming certain physical parameters are small. So I hope this is a little bit clearer as to what we are computing.
This makes sense.
Yes.
But, so one question I have is, where does inverse square come into this? So R0 is what Newton did, and that is inverse square. But
no. All of this is inverse square. Let me be very clear. This is simply a proposed expansion of the position of the moon. Now, this is going to be put into the equation of motion, the inverse square equation of motion. That is not being changed. You are going to determine r of t by imposing Newton's second law subject to the inverse square gravitational force.
Okay.
That equation will lead to a differential equation for r of t. Yeah. You simply put this in that differential equation and expand everywhere you see an r of t in this kind of series.
Okay.
All right.
Yeah, it makes sense now. I get where I was confused. Now it makes sense.
Okay, good.
Thank you, sir.
All right, you're welcome, Gautam. Yes. Any other question?
Sir?
Yes.
So could you just repeat what you said about writing this series wherever you see r in the equation?
Yeah, that is easily done. Yeah. Let me do that in a paper. See, the equation says mr ... is some force, right? Now, difficult to solve. Okay, that is the problem we are faced with, because f itself is some complicated function, maybe some g by r squared. Yeah. So on the face of it, I don't know how to solve this equation, but somebody says I should really think of r. Let me think of r of t as some r0 of t times some ratio mm over ms plus ... Okay. And so I'm being a little bit oversimplified here. So when I say put it in there, I mean do the following. Wherever you see r, I will write it as m times r0 ... plus r1 ... times, let me call this ratio a small quantity, a small quantity epsilon plus r2 ... epsilon squared plus ... Okay. And on the right hand side, you will get, wherever you see this, you will put the same series in here, r0 plus epsilon, r1 plus epsilon squared, r2, and so on. Yeah. So do you understand what I mean by put it in?
Yeah, sir.
Yes.
And we're doing this because the original thing is difficult to solve immediately. So we are
Correct. Exactly. And the point is that if you replace this f by f of r0 plus epsilon f prime of r0 times r1 plus ... and keep only terms to leading order in epsilon, the problem simplifies. Okay, so that is the idea. Maybe I will give some example of this in some much simpler context. It's a bit hard to follow in this whole big context.
Is this like the general power series solution of a differential equation?
That is right. It is a power series solution of a differential equation, but not a power series in time. That's not what we're doing. So power series in some other parameter that appears in the problem.
Okay, R.
Yeah. No. Okay. Look. I have to be much more careful. Let's be more clear.
Power series in several variables, but yeah, maybe similar.
No, I think part of the problem is I have not written what f is. Yeah, f of r. Let me write that. Then you will know what I mean. Yeah. So the point is that f of r is a complicated function. There are two forces present. One, the gravitational force of the sun on the moon. The other, the gravitational force of the earth on the moon. Right? This is the essential problem. If you ignore the sun's effect, then the problem is solvable because it reduces to the two-body problem of the motion of the moon in the Earth's presence. And the solution is an ellipse. You know how to solve that problem. Sadly, we don't know how to solve the problem when you include this. Therefore, we are going to treat this term as a small correction to that term, okay, in an appropriate manner. This is what the essential thing is. And when you do this kind of expansion and so on, the effect of this term will be treated only to leading order in epsilon, whereas this term will be treated exactly. That's the kind of thing that we are doing. This really deserves a discussion in its own right, or in a much simpler example, which I don't want to attempt to do now. But the good news is that you are all contemplating very good questions of physics and of mathematics. So I am very encouraged. Even if you are discouraged. Okay, so Srimati and now Vijayan, is it okay if I any lingering question about this now?
No, sir.
Okay. All right.
Is there somehow something getting that we can predict the trajectory by finding the extremal of some quantity? Is there something?
That is a separate principle. Yeah, that is that took further time. It was due to Euler and Lagrange and so on. Yeah. Yes, and yes, it is true that one can regard Newtonian trajectories not just as solutions to Newton's differential equation, but as extrema of something else. Now this is a very nice idea because I will explain it in a very simple way. Static solutions are where x double dot is equal to f is equal to 0 and x dot is also 0. Yeah, x is independent of time. So one way to get it is by solving these differential equations. Yeah, static solutions means x must be independent of time, so x dot must be 0. There must be no force. Yeah, but look, that can also be regarded. Static solutions are extrema of a function if f is equal to minus dv by dx. Right? Suppose f is a conservative force and is given by the derivative of a potential, then static solutions are given by dv by dx equal to 0, x equal to x static. Now this idea that you can find the solution to a certain differential equation by finding the extremum of some function is a very deep idea. It turns out this can be generalized beyond static solutions to time-dependent solutions. That is the idea of Lagrange and Euler, and leads to the so-called action principle or variational principle. Okay, any other question? If not, we are now out of time, so we shall stop here then and continue the next topic on Tuesday. Any other queries right now about what we have discussed?
So can I follow up on this for a bit?
Okay, yes, Romit Roy Chaudhary.
I'm not sure why this is a deep idea. I mean, in the sense, like, wouldn't finding the potential and then the extrema be quite like similar to the things we've done? I mean, clearly I'm not understanding something, but.
Okay, so I mean, okay. Look, okay, before I answer your question, it is not an exaggeration to say that this is the deepest idea in the whole of classical physics. So with that preface, let me mention that and an idea is deep if it helps you to solve many other problems in the subsequent era. Okay, and that is what has been the lesson of physics of the last 300 years. That if you can formulate a problem which originally arose as a differential equation as an extremization problem of extremizing some quantity, then it is very, very helpful. Yeah. So I gave a very simple example of it. Yeah, somebody tells you that the force is given by minus kx minus gx cubed. Yeah, this is the force felt by a particle. Find the static solutions. Okay. In this case, it is not so difficult to work out what the static solutions are, but I think you will agree that it is a useful insight to notice that if you consider the function v of x as kx squared upon 2 plus gx to the power of 4 upon 4 and look for extrema of v of x, or even simply plot it. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, depends if g is positive, negative. So let me take k negative and g positive. Then you plot this function, you will immediately find those static solutions. Yeah, so it gives a geometric way of thinking about it. Now, then this in itself is not very deep, as you say, because yeah, okay, putting this equal to 0 or finding the extreme of v are one and the same. The deep thing is that this generalizes beyond static solutions to time-dependent solutions. Okay. Time-dependent solutions are those where this is equal to x double dot times some mass, where we are not putting it equal to 0. It is some time-dependent motion. How can you think of a time-dependent motion as the extremum of some quantity? Now, this question was answered by Euler and Lagrange, and that is the deep idea. I'm not presenting the idea here. It goes well beyond what we have talked about here, but that is the thing. So, Romit, am I moving in the direction of your question?
Yes, I think so.
Okay, fine. Yeah, so there is absolutely no doubt. This is among the deepest ideas in classical physics, and the reason it is so deep idea of classical physics is that it leads to quantum physics as well. It leads to the formulation of quantum physics as well. So deep ideas in classical physics have their depth is really appreciated further when you look at it in quantum physics. Quantum physics is formulated not by somehow quantizing this Newton equation. That's a very complicated way of looking at it.
Sir, one rising principle we have already studied, that Fermat's principle of light.
Yes. So that is a precursor of this, indeed. Yeah. Fermat's principle is already one such thing, that the light follows a path that extremizes the time elapsed. That is right. So the Euler and Lagrange and others generalized this from light to particle mechanics. Indeed. So you are familiar with it in some sense.
But sir, do we know why that this kind of extremization happens at all scales? Like you said, it happens in classical physics, which could be all the way to the scale of like planets and galaxies and stuff, right? But even you said for quantum mechanics, there are these extremization principles. Like, do we know why?
No, I didn't say there are extremization principles, but the formulation of classical mechanics in terms of extremization principles helps to formulate quantum physics. Quantum physics is no longer extremization problem. It is more than that. But the quantity which you extremize to get classical trajectories plays a central role in the quantum theory. That's the point. You no longer simply extremize it. You have to average over it. That is a new problem that has to be addressed. So it's just that the quantity that comes up in this extremization problem then becomes the central guiding object in the quantum theory. But why does it work I mean, the classical physics works at terrestrial, celestial scales, etc. Why does it work? No, we are not addressing that question here. We find out what, we try things out. If they work, we feel happy. There is no clear answer to why it works. I don't know if I didn't mean to belittle the thing, but please revise your question if you want to, Anand.
No, sir. I just thought that like the same, like if the same object is useful on all these different scales, maybe there's some speculation as to, what makes it so useful. But no, you answered my question.
Okay. Thanks. Yeah. No, I mean, there is no. It is yeah. I don't have a simple answer to that question. No. It is just a useful concept in the quantum theory. That is all. I mean, on the other hand, Newton's equation is not very useful in the quantum theory. I mean, it is possible to formulate quantum theory in terms of Newton's equation, but it is not the thing that was originally done, and neither is it what we normally use in day-to-day work. It's very difficult to do things that way. I mean, it's possible, but it is more helpful to formulate it in terms of extremization problem and then go to the quantum theory. So anyway, this is a discussion for some other occasion. Any other questions now? Okay, if not, thank you all for your attention and pertinent questions. We will then end this lecture and meet again on Tuesday. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Have a good lunch.
Thank you very much. Yes, yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Yes, you are welcome.
Yes.